They laughed in 2019 when I sold my grandfather's harvester for $6,000 and drove home with 20 beehives stacked in the truck bed instead. I was 26 years old. I owned 41 acres of dying apple trees in Cedar Hollow, Missouri, and I had just turned down an offer of $480,000. If you've ever buried someone and then watched strangers try to buy the grave out from under you, tell me where you're watching this from. And if you know exactly what that feels like, hit like and subscribe before this gets worse, because it does. Loop 1. 11 months after I said no to that check, the company came back with a deadline instead of an offer. Loop 2. The same week, the county sent a man with a clipboard to tell me, in front of 3 of my neighbors, that what I was doing to my orchard was not agriculture, it was superstition. Loop 3. My grandfather's ledgers, 11 of them, cracked leather, sat on my kitchen table with sentences in his handwriting that I didn't understand yet. And somehow, by the end of this, everyone standing in that room laughing at me would need something only I had. My grandfather, Earl Tanner, ran Cedar Hollow Orchard for 52 years. 41 acres of Jonathan and winesap apples on the slope above Route 9, plus 6 acres of scrub timber he refused to clear because, he wrote once, the bees need somewhere ugly to hide. He died in March of a year I still count backward from without meaning to, 18 months before any of this started, and he left me the deed, the 11 ledgers, and $4,000 in a coffee can that the bank had no record of. He did not leave me instructions. He left me observations. Rainfall in inches, hand-recorded, next to notes like hard freeze, bees clustered by the 14th, apple set poor that year, and sprayed neighbor's orchard, dead bees on my fence line for 9 days. He never told me what to do. He told me what he'd seen, for half a century, in a hand that got shakier every year, but never once got sloppy. The ledgers smelled like the shed itself, diesel and dust, and the faint sweetness of old wax. And some nights, I'd hold one up close to the headlamp just to watch the ink shift from black to brown across the decades, his handwriting narrowing as his fingers stiffened, never once switching to pencil, even when the pen clearly hurt him to hold. I read entries about frost dates and aphid counts the way other people read letters from the dead, because that's what they were, only he never once wrote the word love, and somehow every single page was full of it anyway. The community had already decided what to think of me before I did anything. My grandfather was the last full-time orchardist in a valley that had gone over almost entirely to soybeans and a fescue seed operation owned by a company called Halcyon Ag Partners, and when he died, everyone assumed the land would follow the same path: sold, subdivided, gone. Vernon Tuck, who farmed the 400 acres next to mine, and had known me since I was in diapers, told anyone who'd listen that Earl's granddaughter's gonna run that place into the ground inside of 2 years. He didn't say it to my face. He said it at the feed store, at the diner, at the co-op meeting, always with a little laugh at the end, like the laugh made it not cruel. Vernon had known my grandfather longer than my own mother had been alive, had stood at that same fence line more Sundays than I could count, and I understood, in the cold way I understood most things that year, that his laughter wasn't really about me at all. It was about a valley he'd watched empty out field by field for 30 years, and I was just the newest, smallest thing left standing in it. Easy to laugh at because I couldn't yet prove I wouldn't disappear the same way everyone else had. 6 weeks after the funeral, a man in tan wingtip boots that had never touched a furrow in their life walked up my gravel drive holding a folder. He introduced himself as Grant Caldwell, Regional Development Director for Halcyon Ag Partners, and he told me, standing in the exact spot where my grandfather used to graft rootstock every April, that Cedar Hollow's 41 acres would make an ideal site for their new controlled atmosphere storage facility, and that Halcyon was prepared to offer $480,000, which, and I mean this kindly, is more than this operation will earn you in the next 15 years combined. He smiled the whole time. He never once asked what I intended to do with the land. He talked about acreage the way other men talk about inventory, and when I said no, he laughed, not unkindly, which was somehow worse, and said, "You'll call me. Everybody calls me eventually." His wingtips left 2 clean, shining depressions in the soft mud right by the graft bench, out of place against every worn rubber boot print already pressed permanently into that same patch of ground, and I remember thinking, with a flatness that surprised even me, That a man could spend his whole career walking onto land he had no intention of ever tending, in shoes built for exactly that purpose, and never once notice how strange it was to be so certain about ground he'd stood on for 4 minutes. I did not call him. Instead, I read the ledgers at night with a headlamp, because I couldn't afford to run the kitchen light past 9, and I found the same phrase written 4 separate times across 4 separate years, always after a spring where the apple set had failed. No bees, no fruit. Ask the wild ones why they left. My grandfather had watched pollination collapse on his own trees for a decade, and blamed, correctly, the drift spray from 3 farms over, including, though he never named it outright because Halcyon hadn't existed yet under that name, the predecessor company that leased land to the same fescue seed operation, now owned by Caldwell's employer. He never had the money to fix it. He had $4,000 in a coffee can, and 52 years of Sundays spent watching what was left of the wild bees do half the work his orchard needed, and no more. I had a harvester that hadn't run in 2 seasons because I couldn't afford the belt, and a shed my grandfather had built in 1987 that was structurally sound and completely empty. I sold the harvester for $6,000 to a man from Licking, Missouri, who didn't ask why a working farm was getting rid of it, and I drove to a bee supplier 3 counties over and came home with 20 nucleus hives, a smoker, 2 suits, and 40 pounds of sugar for feeding through the first winter. Vernon Tuck was standing at his mailbox when I passed with the truck bed stacked and buzzing, and he laughed loud enough that I heard it over the engine. "Whole harvest sittin' in boxes," he called after me. "Earl'd have a fit." I didn't answer him. I never explained myself more than once, and I'd already explained myself 0 times, so I didn't start. The plan, if you could call $4,000 and a headlamp a plan, was this: rebuild pollination first, fruit second, income third, and do it without a single dollar spent on the pesticide or fertilizer regimen every other orchard in the valley used, because the ledgers made it plain that regimen was exactly what had starved the wild bee population in the first place. I planted 3 acres of buckwheat and native clover in the scrub timber my grandfather had refused to clear, the same ground he'd called ugly and useful in the same sentence. I set the hives in staggered rows along the tree line, facing east, the way one water-stained page from 1994 told me to, angled so the morning sun hit them before it hit the orchard, waking the bees before the blossoms opened. I did every bit of it with my own hands, because I could not afford to hire it done, and because I did not trust anyone else's hands with the only 20 boxes standing between me and losing this place for real. My palms cracked and bled at the knuckles from hauling frames in the cold before the suits arrived, and I learned the particular ache of carrying a hive body loaded with brood comb up a slope steep enough that my boots slid in the wet clay, twice, both times catching the box against my own chest instead of letting it drop, because losing even one colony that first winter would have meant starting over with less than nothing. The smoker took me 4 tries to keep lit that first week, and I remember the exact smell of the burlap catching, sweet and choking, and the sound underneath the hum of the bees themselves, a low vibration I felt in my back teeth before I ever consciously heard it, that told me, faster than any thermometer could, which boxes were strong and which ones weren't going to make it to March. Dale Pruitt, the county extension agent, came out that August with a clipboard and a look on his face like he'd already written his conclusion before he got out of the truck. He walked the buckwheat rows, said the words unscientific and anecdotal within the same 2 minutes, and told me, in front of Vernon Tuck, who'd conveniently wandered over to watch, that university data showed managed almond-style pollination contracts outperformed backyard apiary methods by a factor I don't remember because I stopped listening at backyard. He said it kindly, the way people say cruel things when they've decided kindness is a tone rather than a behavior. He tapped his clipboard against his thigh the entire time he talked, a habit I'd notice every single visit after that, a small percussive punctuation to every sentence that started with, "the data shows," and ended with a look at Vernon like they were sharing a private joke about the granddaughter playing farmer. I told him I'd show him the yield numbers in 3 years. He said, smiling, that he looked forward to being proven wrong, in the specific tone of a man who has never once been proven wrong and doesn't plan to start, and he wrote something on his clipboard before he left that I never did get to see, though I'd have bet the coffee can it wasn't flattering. He came back the following spring with the same clipboard and told me, this time in front of 2 other growers at a co-op meeting I hadn't wanted to attend, that my apple set percentage was within normal variance, nothing to draw conclusions from yet, which was Dale's way of saying I'd been right and he wasn't ready to say so. Vernon Tuck, sitting next to him with his cap pushed back, said, loud enough for the whole folding chair semicircle to hear, "Give her time, Dale. She'll figure out this ain't a hobby farm." And 3 other growers laughed the specific laugh of men who'd already decided the outcome and just wanted to enjoy the show while it lasted. I sat with my coffee going cold in a styrofoam cup and said nothing, because I'd learned by then that explaining myself in that room only fed whatever they'd already decided to believe. I wrote Dale's exact numbers into my own ledger that night, the 12th one, the first one that was entirely mine, underneath my grandfather's last entry, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt like I'd started a debt someone was going to have to pay eventually, and I intended to collect, with interest, in front of the same folding chairs. If you've ever had someone smile at you while explaining exactly why you're going to fail, and you've had to nod and go home and keep doing the thing anyway with nobody but a dead man's handwriting for company, subscribe now, because the part where it comes back on all of them is coming, and I promise you it's worth the wait. Caldwell's second visit came 11 months after the first, and this time the folder had a date on it. Halcyon had filed for an eminent domain-adjacent easement claim through the county, arguing the storage facility qualified as regional agricultural infrastructure, which meant they didn't need my signature, only my silence, and they had 90 days to get it. He stood in the same spot again, wingtips again, and said, almost bored, "This doesn't have to be adversarial. 480 was generous. It's 420 now, but it's still generous, and it saves us both a legal fight you won't win." I asked him if he'd read the county's own soil survey for that parcel. He hadn't. I had. It listed my orchard's watershed as a documented recharge zone for 3 residential wells downhill, mine included, which meant any filing had to clear an environmental review Halcyon hadn't budgeted the time for. I didn't argue. I just said read page 11, then went back to feeding sugar water to a hive that was still building comb in April cold, my hands shaking slightly from more than just the temperature, though I didn't let him see that part, and I didn't turn around again until I heard his truck doors close and his tires pull gravel all the way back out to Route 9. That legal filing sat on my kitchen table for 6 weeks next to the ledgers, a stack of paper thinner than any single notebook of my grandfather's, but somehow heavier, and I read the county soil survey 3 separate times before I trusted my own understanding of page 11 enough to stake anything on it. It was dense with hydrology terms I had to look up one at a time on a phone with 2 bars of signal, but the sentence that mattered was plain enough once I found it. The parcel sat inside a mapped recharge zone feeding 3 residential wells, a designation that triggered a mandatory environmental review before any easement claim involving soil disturbance could be filed, a review Halcyon's legal team clearly hadn't budgeted time or money for, because their filing referenced an outdated 2011 survey that predated the recharge zone designation entirely. That night I sat on the porch steps with the coffee can, empty now, $4,000 gone into hive bodies and clover seed, and a used extractor I'd bought off a Mennonite family 2 hours south, and I let myself, for exactly the length of 1 cigarette I don't even smoke, wonder if Vernon Tuck was right. 41 acres, 20 boxes of insects, a dead man's handwriting, and a corporation with lawyers on retainer. I thought about selling. I thought about it hard enough to feel it in my chest like hunger. Then I opened the 11th ledger, the one from the year before he died, to the page I'd read so many times the crease had gone soft, where he'd written, in a hand already starting to shake, "Bad years teach the orchard. Good years teach nothing." Don't let anybody rush you into a good year. I didn't cry. I never cried in front of anybody, and I wasn't going to start crying in front of an empty coffee can. I just closed the ledger, went to bed, and got up at 5 to check the hives like it was any other morning, because it was. The frost had left a thin white rind on every box lid that morning, and I remember standing there in the half-dark with my breath fogging in front of me, listening for the hum before I even lifted a lid, because that sound, faint and steady under the cold, had become the only reassurance I trusted, more than any number Dale Pruitt or Grant Caldwell could put in front of me. The drought hit the region in year 3, the worst since 1988, according to the same extension office that employed Dale Pruitt, and it exposed every orchard in the valley that had been running on managed pollination contracts and heavy irrigation instead of resilient ground cover. Halcyon's own fescue seed acreage, the very fields feeding their storage facility justification, lost 40% of expected yield because the leased pollination contractors couldn't truck enough hives in fast enough when 3 counties all needed them in the same 11-day bloom window. Vernon Tuck's 400 acres, dependent on the same contracted hives, came in at 58% of a normal harvest. My 41 acres, pollinated by 20 hives that never left the property, and 3 acres of buckwheat that kept them fed and healthy through every dry spell, came in at 91% of a normal harvest. And the honey alone, 1,100 pounds of it that year, sold direct at $14 a pound instead of wholesaled through anybody, outsold the entire apple crop by itself. Numbers don't laugh at you. They also don't apologize. They just sit there, correct, waiting for someone to add them up in public. I remember the smell of that August better than I remember most conversations from it. Dust so fine it hung in the air past sundown, the creek down to a trickle you could step over without wetting your boot sole, and underneath all of it, faint and constant, the smell of clover still holding moisture in the buckwheat rows because the root systems ran deeper than anything the neighboring fescue fields had ever bothered to grow. The bees worked through the worst of it anyway, slower, quieter, but they worked, because they had 3 acres of forage that didn't depend on a well-running dry, and every evening I'd stand at the tree line and listen to that low hum holding steady, while I could hear, from Vernon's direction, nothing at all, which told me everything about his hives before the harvest numbers ever confirmed it. The co-op posted county yield comparisons every October on the board outside the grain elevator, the same board Dale Pruitt had stood in front of when he told me my method was anecdotal. My name was at the top that year, 41 acres outperforming operations 10 times the size, and underneath the number was a line I hadn't asked anyone to add: pollination method, independent apiary, 0 contracted hives. Dale came out one more time that November, no clipboard, and said the extension office wanted to feature Cedar Hollow in next year's regional bulletin as a case study. I said he could quote my actual numbers, the ones from his own visits, dated in his own handwriting, and he had the decency to look uncomfortable before he agreed. Caldwell's 3rd visit. I'd stopped counting them as separate men and started counting them as the same conversation wearing different weather, came the following February, and this time he brought a woman named Priya Nolan, junior counsel for Halcyon, whose job, it turned out, was to fix the mess the eminent domain filing had made once the county's own environmental review, the one built off page 11 of that soil survey, killed the easement claim outright and left Halcyon needing a supply contract instead of a land grab, because their almond and apple storage clients wanted proof of resilient regional pollination sourcing after watching 3 other suppliers collapse in the drought. Nolan did the talking this time. Caldwell stood by the truck with his wingtips actually muddy for once, saying nothing, which told me more than any folder could have. She offered a 5-year supply contract for managed pollination services across 4 Halcyon-leased properties, at a rate that would have made my grandfather's coffee can look like a joke. I told her I'd consider it on one condition. The contract had to specify 0 synthetic pesticide use within a 2-mile buffer of any hive I placed. In writing, enforceable, because I wasn't going to build another decade of dead bees on someone else's fence line. Caldwell opened his mouth to object. Nolan looked at the drought numbers still sitting on her own company's internal report, looked at him, and said, "Draft it that way." He didn't argue. Men who've been proven wrong in front of witnesses learn to be quiet fast. I watched him study the drought report one more time before he finally nodded, and for just a second his face did something I hadn't seen it do in 3 years of standing on my land uninvited. It looked tired, the way a man looks when the number in front of him has finally outweighed the story he'd been telling himself about who needed whom. The signing happened in the same co-op meeting hall where Dale Pruitt had said anecdotal, and Vernon Tuck had laughed at a truck bed full of boxes, because Nolan wanted regional press there and I didn't object, since regional press was exactly what I wanted too. Caldwell's wingtips were gone that day, replaced by ordinary work boots that still looked too clean, and I noticed it and said nothing, the the same way I'd noticed everything else about him from the first afternoon he stood at my graft bench. He shook my hand for the cameras and said something about shared vision for sustainable agriculture that I let pass without correction, because dignity doesn't require me to argue with a man once he's already lost, and because the cameras were pointed at the yield chart Nolan had propped on an easel beside us, 91% against 58, in numbers big enough to read from the back row, which was the only correction that mattered. Vernon Tuck sat in the third row with his cap in his lap instead of on his head, which I'd never once seen him do indoors in 26 years of knowing him, and he said nothing at all through the entire signing, which from Vernon Tuck was as close to an apology as I was ever going to get, and I didn't push him for more. Somewhere behind him, one of the same growers who'd laughed at the co-op meeting was reading the yield chart with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and I let him have that silence too, because a debt collected loudly is still a debt, but a debt collected quietly is the kind that actually changes how a man behaves the next time he's tempted to laugh at someone standing alone. Dale Pruitt stood near the back with his bulletin draft under his arm and caught my eye once, and nodded, and that was the whole transaction between us, final and sufficient. The years since have been quieter, which is its own kind of reward. Cedar Hollow runs 90 hives now, not 20, spread across 4 halcyon properties and my own 41 acres. Plus a 5th informal arrangement with a widow 2 farms over, who'd watched the whole thing happen, and asked, plainly, if I'd teach her instead of selling her the service. And I said yes, because my grandfather never once charged a neighbor for a lesson, only for the crop. Vernon Tuck sold his fescue operation 4 years after the drought, and leased the ground to a younger grower who plants clover borders without being told to, having watched what happened to the man who didn't. Dale Pruitt's bulletin ran for 3 straight seasons before he retired, and the last one had my numbers on the cover, not as an anecdote, but as a baseline other operations were measured against. Caldwell left Halcyon for a firm 2 states over. I don't know what he does now, and I've stopped being curious. Priya Nolan still calls twice a year, strictly professional, strictly on time, and I respect her for never once pretending our first meeting went any other way than it did. I still have all 12 ledgers. I still add to mine every night, same as my grandfather did. Rainfall in inches, first bloom date, which hives clustered hard through which cold front, and every few pages, a note that isn't about weather at all, a name, a date, a number that finally proved something out loud in front of people who doubted it. My niece, Callie, 17 now, has started keeping her own pages at the back of the 12th ledger, in handwriting that's neater than mine ever was, and will probably get shakier with age the same way his did, and I don't correct her observations, I only ask her what she saw, because that's the only inheritance that ever actually worked in this family. Not land, not money, just the discipline of writing down what's true before you're tempted to write down what you wish were true instead. Last spring I caught her sitting on the same porch step where I'd once emptied that coffee can in my head, holding one of the oldest ledgers up to the light the exact way I used to, tracing a line of my grandfather's handwriting with one finger, and when she asked me what "no bees, no fruit," ask the wild ones why they left, meant, I told her the same way he would have told me if he'd lived long enough to. Not with an explanation, but with a walk to the tree line at dusk, so she could hear the hum for herself and decide what it meant on her own terms, the way every real answer on this land has ever actually arrived. My grandfather spent 52 years watching a slope of apple trees fail slowly for reasons nobody around him wanted to name, and I spent 3 years watching 20 boxes of insects prove every one of those reasons correct in public. If you had $4,000, a dead man's notebook, and every neighbor you'd ever known laughing at the same time, how long would you be willing to wait to be right? Next time I'll show you exactly what page 11 of that soil survey said, and why it's the only page in this entire story that actually mattered. But you already sat through this whole thing without looking away once, which means you already know what kind of person hits subscribe before the next video starts. So go ahead and be that person now.